To understand the man who would eventually become the soul of a revolution, we have to look back at the boy he was before the world knew his name. José Rizal's own account of his life isn't just a list of dates or achievements, it's a story of a very specific kind of tension. It's the tension between a deeply religious, warm upbringing and the harsh, often cruel realities of colonial life in the Philippines. He was born in 1861 in a place called Kalamba, into a household that was both disciplined and full of love. His early years were defined by the rhythms of a large religious family. But even in that nurturing environment, the shadows were already creeping in. The first real crack in his childhood innocence came with the death of his sister, Concha. It was his first encounter with grief, a quiet but profound realization that the people you love can simply be gone. As he grew, his world expanded beyond the walls of his home to the formal, often rigid, schooling in Biñan. This wasn't the gentle learning of a home tutor. It was a place of strict discipline and the sting of corporal punishment. He was a small, quiet boy, navigating a system where mistakes were met with physical correction. Yet, even amidst that austerity, he found a way to express himself. He spent time apprenticing under an elderly painter named Juanco, a period that allowed his artistic soul to begin its first real awakening. But the most defining trauma of his youth, the event that would leave a permanent mark on his psyche, didn't happen in a classroom. It happened at home, and it involved his mother. She was falsely accused of being part of a plot to poison her own brother-in-law. For 2.5 years, she was imprisoned. During that time, she was subjected to brutal, coerced confessions that left her broken. Watching this happen, seeing the legal system used as a weapon against his own mother, instilled in young José a deep-seated distrust of authority. He saw firsthand how the mechanisms of power could be twisted to serve injustice, and that realization would stay with him for the rest of his life. When he eventually moved to Manila to attend the Ateneo Municipal, he entered a world that was highly structured and intensely competitive. The Jesuits had a very specific way of running their classrooms. Students were divided into 2 competing groups, or empires, the Romans and the Greeks. It was a system designed to foster constant, driving ambition. Rizal didn't start at the top. He began at the bottom of this academic hierarchy, a quiet boy working his way up through sheer intellect and an incredible sense of discipline. He didn't just participate, he ascended. He moved through the ranks until he eventually achieved the highest status, the rank of emperor. He was winning academic prizes and becoming a standout student, but this wasn't just about grades. And this was a period of profound intellectual transformation. As he grew, his mind began to wander beyond the religious texts that had dominated his early education. He started reading history and romantic novels, specifically works like The Count of Monte Cristo. These stories of justice, revenge, and the struggle against oppression began to shape his worldview. He was no longer just a student memorizing lessons, he was a thinker starting to see the larger patterns of the world. During these years at Ateneo, his personal life and his intellectual life were deeply intertwined. There was a moment of profound emotional significance when he had a dream, a prophetic dream as he described it, that his mother would finally be released from prison. When that reunion finally happened, it was a moment of immense relief and spiritual connection. But the victory was bittersweet. The years of imprisonment and the stress of her legal battle had taken a physical toll on her. She was losing her eyesight. This brings us to one of the most striking themes in his story, the symbolism of sight. His mother's failing vision wasn't just a personal tragedy for the family, it became a metaphor for the state of the Philippines under colonial rule. It was as if the darkness encroaching on her eyes mirrored the blindness of a society where injustice could be committed in broad daylight, and where the truth was often obscured by those in power. As he completed his studies at Ateneo, we see a shift in his trajectory. He had initially enrolled in metaphysics, a branch of philosophy that deals with the most abstract and fundamental questions of existence. It was the path his father had intended for him. But as he delved into these high-minded, abstract ideas, he found himself being pulled towards something much more concrete and much more urgent. He was increasingly drawn to the social and historical realities of his country. The abstract questions of, why do we exist, were being overtaken by the much more pressing question of, how do we live justly in this world? When we look back at this period of his life, we can see a powerful duality at play, a movement between light and shadow. There is the light of his early, joyful religious memories and his academic triumphs, but it is always tempered by the shadow of grief, the shadow of his mother's suffering, and the shadow of a corrupt system. The structure of his education at Ateneo also tells us something about the world he was growing up in. The empire system of competition reflected the highly stratified, hierarchical nature of colonial society. To succeed, one had to master the rules of the system, to climb the ladder, to prove one's worth within a rigid framework. Rizal did exactly that, but in doing so he gained the very tools, the education, the language, the intellectual standing that he would eventually use to challenge the system itself. His journey from a sensitive, disciplined child in Kalamba to a formidable intellectual in Manila is essentially the story of an awakening. It's the transition from a child who experiences the world as a series of events happening to him, to a thinker who begins to understand the forces that drive those events. He moved from the informal spiritual learning of his home to a formal secular understanding of history and politics. This wasn't just an academic shift, it was a psychological one. He was moving away from the comfort of religious certainty and toward the difficult, often painful, work of understanding social reality. This evolution is what made him so dangerous to the colonial authorities. He wasn't just a rebel, he was a man who understood the mechanics of power, who had seen its cruelty up close, and who had been trained in the very intellectual traditions that the colonizers themselves used to justify their rule. His life, as he tells it, is a testament to the idea that personal experience is never truly private. The injustice done to his mother, the loss of his sister, the rigors of his schooling, these weren't just personal hardships. They were the building blocks of a national consciousness. They shaped his character, and in doing so, they helped shape the path of a nation. As he moved toward those higher studies, leaving behind the abstract world of metaphysics for the tangible, often bloody reality of Philippine history, he was stepping into a role that was already being carved out for him. The boy from Kalamba was disappearing, and the man who would change the course of history was beginning to emerge.